From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Rosie Wright. As US and Israeli warplanes unleashed wave upon wave of attacks on Iran in this past week, a team of intelligence operatives were working relentlessly behind the scenes to identify which targets to strike. Now, 20 years ago, when the US invaded Iraq, that team would have consisted of 2,000 plus people. Today, it's about 20. Why? Enter artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence is quietly becoming a central player on the battlefield, speeding up targeting, analyzing intelligence, and raising new questions about human oversight in war.
The use of AI in warfare has been long talked about in the abstract, but clearly the war in Iran has shown its use in real time, particularly the extraordinary speed it's bringing to battlefield decision-making.
The real story here is how America's AI crushed Iran's response time. This isn't AI theory anymore. This is AI combat, and it's happening now.
But there's controversy right in the center of how exactly the US military is using AI. Just the day before the war in Iran began, the AI company Anthropic, they've been a key part of the US's military AI infrastructure, they were dropped. The company's CEO had real ethical concerns about how his own technology was being used.
We have said to the Department of War that we are okay with all use cases except for two. One is domestic mass surveillance. Case number two is fully autonomous weapons. If you have a large army of drones or robots that can operate without any human oversight, that presents concerns. The technology is advancing so fast that it's out of step with the law.
So, was he blowing the whistle on a perilous new era of warfare? What are the dangers when a robot can make battlefield decisions quicker than the speed of thought?
When you have a world that's streamlined through automated decision-making, the role of diplomacy that defined so much of the periods of relative peace that have been experienced over the centuries, that may well be a thing of the past.
The story today, how AI is transforming the battlefield.
I'm David Leslie. I'm professor of ethics, technology, and society in the Digital Environment Research Institute at Queen Mary University of London.
You've observed demonstrations of military systems using AI. I think it can sound a bit sort of sci-fi, a bit Terminator, a little bit scary. Can you tell us what you've seen?
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that we are experiencing a transformation of warfare, where AI is increasingly being integrated across the sort of military landscape. And so when one observes how the systems are actually being used, it's actually more banal, if you will, than an image of Terminator or killer robots. So basically, you've got these data-driven systems that are incredible at synthesizing very large amounts of data and sort of taking in intelligence data, surveillance data, reconnaissance data, and then processing all that information and ultimately making predictions about what are the most optimal strategies of deploying a particular weapon, what are the targets that should be struck, that type of thing. And so if you can just imagine, as we are on our mobile phones or on our iPads interacting with information, this is really the way it's happening right now. There's nothing sort of compellingly different from how we interact with the technology in our everyday lives, from how these are manifesting across the sort of military system.
What it has done is, in quite an aggressive fashion, accelerated sort of the speed and the efficiency of a lot of the military processes.
I think that's correct. If one can imagine how much time it would take individual humans or human teams to go through the types of data that will inform these AI systems in the military. You've got satellite imagery, drone footage, signal intercepts, financial transactions, the mobile communications that are captured. There's a tremendous amount of different data points that are now being integrated into these military AI systems. And so what that means is the chain of decision-making, the so-called kill chain, if you're thinking about a military operation, is being compressed, and the tempo of machine speed warfare is kind of incomprehensibly greater. It's more accelerated than if these systems weren't being used.
You just mentioned a kill chain. Can you explain what that is?
So when we think of the chain of decision-making, straight from a decision to engage in military action, a decision of a commander, a field commander, to allocate troops in a certain way, straight down to military personnel deciding to engage targets, whether that's from the air or from the ground. The kill chain is this sort of longer set of links between all of the decision-making in that arc, right, from the top to the bottom.
So it's the process of sort of finding the target, assessing it, hitting it, and then assessing if the strike, let's say, was successful or not. That's all happened now in a much shorter time frame.
Correct. And all of those elements are, in a sense, being supplemented right now by automated means, by AI that can identify, after a strike is made, these systems are able to identify damage, identify collateral damage, identify if the target was successfully struck, that type of thing.
That obviously raises so many kind of ethical questions about the human's involvement in that process. And I think we'll come on to that in a little bit. It would be helpful to understand really how transformational then what we're seeing in AI and the advances there, what transformation that is having on modern warfare.
So we've spoken about the kind of accelerated pace of machine speed warfare, but we also have to acknowledge that there are other AI sort of use cases that are manifesting, especially in the current Iranian conflict. So, for instance, you have the use of what are called Lucas drones, low-cost, uncrewed combat attack systems. These are basically unmanned drones that are AI-enabled. So these are basically cheap, one-way kamikaze weapons that are being used to attack targets in Iran. And they have machine learning supplementing navigation and target identification, but also these systems that link the individual drones to each other to evade detection or to have other evasive maneuvering. And so you have a very concrete physical manifestation of AI that's actually happening now. And if one can imagine, each one of these drones, it's reported to cost about $35,000, which it's about 1% of what a comparable weapon of war would have cost in the pre-kind of AI modality.
I mean, you mentioned Iran. We're watching this all play out in real time over the last few days. The US, it's been reported, is sort of using extensively AI to identify targets, roll out the strike action. Tell us how they've been using it.
So based on reporting, I mean, we should just note that a lot of this is from reporting and evidence, but the military is itself not very transparent about how AI is being used. Both
understandably, yeah.
Both the Israeli and the US military. But what we do know is that in the US case, if you think of the amount of human time and human effort that would take to simultaneously identify up to 1,000 targets that were attacked in real time all at once, we're talking a kind of a strategic expenditure of time that could have taken weeks, months. And because you have these data aggregation and reasoning and decision support systems that are providing target packages, so options for courses of action. They are also providing prioritization recommendations about what targets need to be prioritized, providing very detailed information about coordinates of where these targets are. all of these contributions, if you will, to the decision chain transformed what may have taken months into literally hours or minutes. And that type of acceleration, right, is really, I think, at the heart of this kind of transformative moment.
What we're seeing in Iran is kind of right at the forefront now of what the US military is able to do with AI. But also over the last 5 years or so, I guess the Ukrainians have trained and learned how to lever AI and how to best put forward their practices on the battlefield as well.
Right, and you have Zelensky now offering some of that, knowledge to this particular situation in Iran.
Партнери звертаються до нас, до України, щоб ми допомогли.
Partners are turning to us, to Ukraine, asking for help in defending against Shahed drones with expertise and real operational experience. There have also been requests from the American side.
The situation in Ukraine was really, if you will, a proving ground or even a laboratory for how one could use AI and data-driven systems to have more effective targeting or defense, for instance, against the drones that the Russians were using, or having more effective ways to engage in this kind of drone warfare. And so the Ukrainians have developed all sorts of methodologies to train machine learning enhanced drones, for instance. They have a whole program where they have a kind of cordoned off research environment to train drones with the information and data that has been gathered right over the last few years of combat.
And also for defense. I mean, I saw one example of Ukraine using a fully AI-controlled turret that could detect, shoot down Russian drones without any human involved in that process at all.
Right. And so we're at this moment, right, where the Ukrainians have really had to deal with these Shahed drones, these Iranian-produced drones for a number of years. And that experience has really been an enabler of the development of Ukraine's own approach to AI and technology in warfare, which is significant. I mean, the learnings have been significant, and Ukraine has been actually quite an innovative nation state when it comes to using technology.
So take us back a little bit. When did the US military decide to sort of start betting big on AI?
I mean, AI or data analytics, or however you want to call it, machine learning, have arguably been an interest of the US military in particular for a generation. This isn't anything new. What we do see, however, if you think back to, was at the end of 2022 when ChatGPT, right, became this kind of industrial force in the world, there was this moment where the era of large-scale AI, of hyperscaled AI, sort of appeared on the scene commercially. And I think this was really a turning point, because there was a recognition, actually, that with the scaling of these systems, you had sophisticated inferential capacities, sophisticated cognitive capacities emerging in these systems that made them very operationally useful in ways that they hadn't been before. I think it was actually around that moment where Vladimir Putin now kind of infamously said, whoever controls AI will rule the world. And I think that was a signal. It was a moment where the US military, and I think more generally the geopolitics of AI, really became a focus of the US.
It'd be good to understand the history of these relationships then between the AI companies and the military arm of the governments that have been sort of working with them. So tell us about the relationship that the US military currently has with Anthropic, and remind us who they are.
Right. So Anthropic is an interesting company. It was founded by Dario Amodei and his sister. Dario Amodei was one of the early pioneers and researchers that were developing these so-called large language models. I think initially he worked for Google and then for OpenAI. He actually founded Anthropic as a breakaway company, taking a handful of people from OpenAI to found this company. And the concern that he had that motivated that break was that OpenAI at the time hadn't been taking AI safety seriously enough. And so they formed themselves as a public benefit company to, if you will, develop these powerful sort of, frontier AI technologies, but with a more concerted effort to do that in a safe way. And so what's been interesting is, despite all of that, Anthropic has become the main US military contractor when it comes to large language models. It was Anthropic's Claude, which Claude is this large language and multimodal model that Anthropic has developed. Claude was the first, and I think still the only, frontier AI model that was approved to operate in the classified AWS, Amazon Web Services cloud within the US military.
And we believe then it's being used in these military campaigns.
Undoubtedly.
This proves a real problem then for the CEO, because just a day before the US and Israel start this campaign in Iran, you've got the CEO putting his hand up and saying, there are some serious ethical considerations here, and the relationship sours so significantly.
The president posted today, in response to the situation, their selfishness, referring to Anthropic, is putting American lives at risk. What's your response?
Even if the Department of War, or even if the Trump administration takes these unprecedented measures against us, this kind of supply chain designation that's normally used against foreign adversaries, we'll do everything we can to support the Department of War to provide its technology for as long as it takes to offboard us and onboard, a competitor who's willing to do these things that we are not willing to do.
Well, so I think the backstory of this is, in January, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, issued a memo that basically stated that the US military would become an AI-first operation. And what that entailed, right, was a kind of no-holds-bar development of AI across all US military technologies. And at the time, I think the people at Anthropic who have developed these systems to have constraints based on what they call constitutional AI, so rules that have been kind of, if you will, woven into the training of the models. The people at Anthropic, Dario Amodei in particular, had issues with, first, the use of Claude or Anthropic's AI in lethal autonomous weapons, and also the potential for the use of the technologies for mass surveillance of US citizens and nationals. And so those two terms were, for him, non-negotiable in terms of the restrictions that were to be put on the US military usage of the technology. And of course, that was not acceptable to Trump or to Hegseth. And the rest is, as it were, is history, right? The Trump administration has now kind of ruled that because of this dispute, Anthropic is not a trusted contractor anymore, and will basically be blacklisted from not just the military contracts, but from all government contracts, and from all contracts and companies that have anything to do with government and military contracts.
So you have this huge rift, and despite the fact the US military are still using Anthropic's technology in their current military action, it now means the door is open to another, because that relationship's totally broken down, as you've laid out. It opens the door to another AI company to step in, maybe a company who doesn't have the same ethical considerations that we've seen before. So who fills the gap?
Well, so this is a bit ironic, if you will. I think the very day that there was this explicit rift, that there was an announcement that Anthropic would be kind of blacklisted, OpenAI kind of shows up. And Sam Altman makes an announcement that OpenAI has agreed to sort of now stand in and be the large language model or the foundation model provider for the US military, with the understanding at that time that they would allow for any lawful uses, which was what the US military was requesting. Now, that being said, very shortly after that, there was resistance, even within OpenAI, about that decision making. And Sam Altman and OpenAI had to backpedal a little bit and renegotiate at least the kind of public-facing elements of the contract, where there now is provisions that OpenAI is willing to have this any lawful use sort of basis. But at the same time, they feel like it's unacceptable to have, for instance, mass surveillance use cases or even lethal autonomous weapon use cases. And so it's ironic in the sense that some of the very terms that caused the rift with Anthropic are now being kind of acknowledged in this new relationship.
David, you're telling us how you have an AI founder so cautious about his own technology that he withdrew it from the plans of the US military. So what are some of the key ethical issues to be aware of the technology itself? This is your area of expertise.
Right. So I think there's a range of really important ethical hazards and moral risks that we need to think about. First, the risk comes from what we've been talking about, which is this kind of increased tempo. So what happens in machine speed warfare is you have a real hazard that the so-called human in the loop will play less and less of an active, deliberative role in actually making informed decisions along the so-called kill chain. So everything from a commander under time pressure making a decision about a particular set of targets and having to rely on the recommendations of a system that is, for all intents and purposes, intransparent or opaque to that commander, you have a real risk of they're developing what's called automation bias, where you have over-reliance on the recommendations without active engagement, over-compliance with the recommendations, and ultimately rubber stamping, right? Where the pressing of the engagement button at the end of these automated recommendation processes is just a formality, and the human role in actually thinking deliberatively about that kind of set of complex issues becomes less and less active.
Do you sort of mean, normally in working out how you do something, you've simultaneously had time to really think about if you should do it. And that decision time is really shortened now.
Right. There's an important element where when we are considering, what we should do or what the kind of conditions and context of a decision are, that there's both a active engagement of our own kind of agency and ourselves in that decision making, but there's also a lot of moral judgment, practical judgment that goes into that. And if we think about life and death decisions within the context of war, there's international humanitarian law, which requires some of these decisions to be made with distinction. So thinking about the potential civilian costs and collateral damage, making distinctions between the combatants and the civilians. There's proportionality, so thinking about how proportional the use of force is given those other background human conditions. And all of those things are part of international humanitarian law.
What oversight is there for AI companies? My sort of sense and impression just over the last 3 years when sort of AI has exploded into more of our sort of day-to-day life is that in every area, whether that's something like the Online Safety Act, how young people are using social media, we put in legislation in place, but it is so far outpaced by AI that legislation is so far behind. And I wonder if you think it's like that in the military field as well. Who's kind of providing the checks and balances for how AI is used?
I think it's exponentially worse, actually, in a way. In the military, there really is no comparable check or balance. And if you look at, for instance, the EU AI Act, right, there's a whole carve-out for national security and defense. And in international AI governance discussions, it seems over and over again that issues of military AI, defense applications, they're off the table because it's hard enough to bring an international group of policymakers together to discuss how they might constrain, these commercial applications. And we really are at a moment where the only constraints that are active out there are international humanitarian law and the laws of war.
Where's the good in how AI is transforming the military?
So I think let me put it this way. So the International Committee of the Red Cross has recently put out some recommendations on how this might be done more responsibly. And some of the insights that come out of that I think are worth paying attention to is all of this data, that can be data that can be used for protective purposes as well. So for instance, you can use some of that data to really have a better idea of where are civilians, how do we avoid, collateral damage and civilian casualty. One can approach these data-rich environments in ways that are extremely protective over international humanitarian law. There would need to be a concerted effort to focus on that as opposed to just increasing the tempo of machine speed warfare. So I think we're at a point where the motivation in the geopolitical moment that we are living through is much more slanted to the development of the efficacy of the lethal military technology.
It's interesting you talk about the geopolitical moment we find ourselves in right now, because many countries, the UK are doing this, they've promised to spend more GDP on defence. And I wonder, we've looked just back over the last 5 years of how AI has already sort of radically changed what's happening on the battlefield. How difficult is it now for those governments in planning for how they're going to spend on defence to defend against another country's AI in 10 years' time? Do we know now what we'll have to be defending against?
So I think the current geopolitical environment is much more complex than it's been in a generation. And I think ultimately what this means is there will need to be the development of more protective orientations in the development of defense and national resilience. And I think that what that means is there will be further development of AI in the EU, obviously in the UK, and in other countries. What will be interesting to see is whether or not a kind of rights-based regional approach will win the day. And so there is a real question if the geopolitical winds will actually blow the development of the technology from a defense perspective to more regional values-based approaches. And I have to say that, if the horse is out of the barn and these technologies are going to be developed, one would hope that they're developed in areas where human rights are a priority in ways that are rights-based and rights-preserving. When you have a world that's streamlined through automated decision-making, the role of diplomacy, the role of that development of international relations that defined so much of the periods of relative peace that have been experienced over the centuries, that may well be a thing of the past. And I think we should all be very concerned about that.
That was David Leslie, Professor of Ethics, Technology and Society in the Digital Environment Research Institute at Queen Mary University of London. The producers today were Harry Stott and Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can do, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back tomorrow.